The COP27 summit has agreed on a climate deal at the closing plenary session of the gathering in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. This deal includes agreement on an historic step to set up a fund to help poor countries ravaged by the impacts of global warming. Developing countries have been asking for financial assistance after climate-related disasters for years, but have had no success until now. COP27 President Sameh Shukri brought the gavel down to signify the approval of the political agreement.
I now invite the COP to adopt the decision entitled Sharm el-Sheikh Implementation Plan contained in document FCC/CP/2022/L19/Rev1. Hearing no objections, it is so decided. I hereby suspend the 10th meeting of the COP.
So how do these agreements affect or favour a developing country like ours? Brandon Abdinor, who is an advocacy lawyer for the Centre for Environmental Rights, joins Full View now. Good evening and welcome, Brandon. Before we get into the substance of some of the agreements and what opportunities there might be for developing nations to be represented, I really enjoyed reading your characterizations of COP27, and I'd like to invite you to paint that picture for our viewers on the contrast between events happening both on the sidelines and then in the negotiating rooms.
Thanks, Iman, and good evening to the listeners. Yeah, it's definitely quite an intense affair. What goes on in the negotiating rooms is generally behind closed doors. So as civil society, we don't really get to see, and we have to rely on sources inside the rooms to send that information. And then on the outside, it's very much like a climate change trade fair, with a lot of pavilions, different countries having pavilions, panel discussions. I think there were around 35,000 delegates, so it certainly is festive in a way, but underlying that is almost desperation and concern about the issues and are the appropriate steps going to be taken this time.
Well, let's go to what our story was talking about, and this is a deal in terms of financial assistance for developing countries around climate-related disasters. From what we understand, there's no detail on exactly how that will manifest, but what are your thoughts as an environmental or climate change advocacy organization around that particular development?
Precisely. It's not even a deal, but it's on the agenda now. So they're talking about funding arrangements for loss and damage. And that is quite a significant victory. I mean, there have been calls for loss and damage to get onto the agenda for a long time now. So the fact that this is on the agenda does signify that some of the pressure brought by developing nations is bearing some fruit. So now that it's on the agenda, we're going to be talking about how exactly on the table, and also with noting that in order to get this is continuing to avoid being directly held liable for paying for these losses and damages.
And let's just talk as well about, the fact that there is a lot that upsets and worries organizations such as yourselves about the outcomes of COP22. Start with a few examples that do not indicate a real commitment to resolving the climate crisis with urgency.
Well, for one, there was a lot of move to try and get a phase out of all fossil fuels on the table, and that did not happen. And at this point in time, we have the same agreement that we had from the COP26 in Glasgow, and that refers to a phase down of unabated coal. We would have liked to see oil and gas being in there, as well as the wording phase out rather than phase down. In the final version, there was also a removal of the references to the request to get countries to increase or improve their nationally determined contributions or goals, and in terms of the Paris Agreement, so that is out as well. So in terms of mitigation, in order to avoid the slow down and stop global warming, that's been significantly watered down. So in that regard, we're seeing things potentially even going in the wrong direction.
Sure. Well, let's talk about the two biggest emitters then, and this is the US and China. And you know what was secured around both those nations, really dealing with and taking responsibility for and shouldering their emissions impact.
Well, there's so many layers to this whole thing, and you'll find there's so many items that countries have different positions on that it's very hard to generalize in terms of exactly what their positions are across all the different aspects. But all reports are that the USA in particular blocked a lot of the moves to see us taking the decisive action that we have. And obviously, being historically the largest emitter, if we did get into a situation where loss and damages were paid commensurate to the harm that was caused, they would be shouldering a big burden of that. And it certainly seems that they have no intention of doing that at this time.
Well, let's bring it home. Our Environment Minister, Barbara Creecy, expressing that this draft text does recognise the urgency of finding solutions for developing countries who suffer loss and damage, with the establishment of a transitional committee, and their job is to look at sources of funding. Just more broadly speaking, what's in it for a developing nation like ours?
Well, I think that depends a lot on what follows from the sort of framework agreements that were reached. I mean, if we do see a loss and damage fund actually getting established and we really see money starting to come into that and flowing to where it's needed, then potentially a country like South Africa could receive compensation, or not compensation, but financial assistance for events like the floods that happened in Durban. Other than that, we'll have to see what's really going to happen. I mean, what it means, the agreement did keep the 1.5 degree temperature increase ambition alive, and apparently that was a close call, but it's there. So what that means for South Africa is that we need to stick firm and try and attain our own Paris Agreement targets, which obviously means back home making energy decisions that are in keeping with emissions reduction that's needed.
I mean, this issue of coal, last year climate talks almost collapsed in Glasgow on the issue of coal. Just again, go back to that one and share with us how well you think, or whether it was properly dealt with, the issue of coal this year.
Well, that remains on the agenda from Glasgow, but that term unabated remains in there as well. And what unabated coal means is coal that doesn't have carbon capture and storage. So the implication is that abated coal is okay. But all the science shows us that that's not actually the case, that the necessary carbon capture and storage technology that abated coal really means does not exist at this point in time in any meaningful way, and cannot be guaranteed to exist. So the bottom line is the science tells us that coal has to go, along with all fossil fuels. The economics bear that out as well. I mean, coal is by far no longer the least cost scenario. And in this final draft that came out now that was approved, there was a lot of reference to renewable energy being necessary, but there were some loopholes left in there, and the agreement speaks of clean energy and low emissions energy. And the concern is that that leaves a door open for gas, for example. And we know there's a strong political lobby to try and elevate natural gas or fossil gas as being a climate solution, which is certainly not the case.
I'm going to ask you a question that maybe is hard to answer, Brandon, and that is, how would you rate the success or the effectiveness of COP27 in terms of real outcomes and wins for developing nations? And maybe you can draw a contrast between the answer and how you see, the previous incarnations of these talks and their value for developing countries.
So there were certainly some wins. I mean, this issue of a loss and damage fund being considered is a win. And if you look at the long tail of that struggle to get that there, it's very significant. Again, that doesn't mean money on the table. And if we looked at other sort of pledges that have been put on the table with regard to, say, adaptation, that money has not been forthcoming. The developed nations pledged $100 billion a year in 2020, and that money has not been forthcoming. So, the difference between pledges and actually receiving assistance is potentially a huge gap. The continued resistance to name the elephant in the room, and that is the combustion of fossil fuels and the way that those loopholes seem to be kept in there and even going in places, is a worry. This year's COP saw a record number of fossil fuel lobbyists and CEOs of multinational fossil fuel companies present, obviously also trying to influence the outcome. I mean, these companies make up to $3 billion a day in profit, effectively. So one can understand why they're going into this climate fight, trying to protect their interests. But until this issue is addressed, we are going to see global warming.
Certainly is a high-stakes game. Brandon Abdinor, thank you for talking to us. Brandon is an advocacy lawyer for the Centre for Environmental Rights.